A lot of people might wonder if, who speaks or who MCs each of the sessions is kind of random, and the answer is no. A lot of people might think I'm excited to be up here because I've been known to spend a few minutes in an MGM resort, but that's not I know Josh is very happy about that, although I think net, at least over the last 5 years, I'm winning, although that might even make you happier, because that means my customer lifetime value is even higher. But regardless, that's not the reason I'm excited to be up here. The second reason people might think is it's kind of, I don't hide it. I mean, Sanjog and I are both friends. We're both trained as statisticians. That's not the reason either that I'm extremely happy to be up here. What's the one unique thing that you notice about this presentation? Any hands up? Let's be students. Any hands up? What's the one? Yes? We have an academic and somebody that works in industry. And so that really is what the Wharton Customer Analytics Initiative is about. It's not about academia. It's not about practice. It's not about academia or practice. It's about academia and practice. And so I was very excited when they told me which one I would be doing. I was like, I'm very excited to do the academia and practice one. And by the way, I don't mind that it's about MGM resorts as well. So that's certainly very exciting. Let me say a few things about our speakers today. Sanjog Misra is a professor of marketing at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA. I followed his career. He was at Rochester prior to that for a while. And Sanjog is kind of one of the world's leading experts in issues like pricing, distribution. I'm most familiar with his work because we've both done some work on Salesforce and Salesforce optimization. And Sanjog is probably in my Mount Rushmore list of people where after reading his papers, I'm like, I wish I had written that paper. And so Sanjog is both a friend and somebody whose academic work I've admired. And I actually, until I got his official bio here, I was not aware that he had worked with companies like Eli Lilly, Adventus, Mercer Consulting, Sprint, obviously MGM, Bausch & Lomb, Xerox, and Lucent Technologies. I just thought he was a famous academic guy. I didn't know that companies had seen the wisdom in working with Sanjog as well, and I'm happy to see that. We also have Josh Swissman here today. Josh is Vice President of Corporate Marketing for MGM Resorts International. Josh's responsibilities include a lot of different things. He has oversight and execution for cross-regional and partner marketing, M-Life development, which is their loyalty-based program, trigger-based marketing, predictive modeling, and analytics. He's also involved in their corporate social gaming strategy. They give me like a one-page bio to read about Josh. I'll let you look him up on your own if you'd like. The part I found most interesting, and I told Josh I was going to say this, Josh began his career with the company in 1999 as a front desk clerk at the Monte Carlo Resort. And so I always admire people. Now, when I say start at the bottom, I'm not implying that the Monte Carlo is not a nice resort and you shouldn't go there. I'm not saying anything about that. All I'm saying is if you took the attributes, front desk clerk and the Monte Carlo Resort, and looked at its cross-Google search with big data and predictive analytics, it would be a very small set. And that's why it's really impressive that Josh has kind of worked his way through the company. And for the students in this room, what it shows you is there is a strong, I don't mean necessarily you should start at desk clerk jobs at the Monte Carlo, but there is a path to the top of a company and to being in very important strategic roles in analytics. And so I'm very excited to have Sanjog and Josh here today, and they're going to talk about using big data at MGM Resorts.
First, I'd just like to thank Eric and Peter and WCAI for having us and letting us speak here. This is a project that was a long time in the making, a few years of work that went into making this happen. And before we start, I'd just like to say that there's a lot of people who are not here today who were also involved, particularly Harikesh Nair, who is my colleague, who is a professor at Stanford, now a full professor at Stanford, and Bill Hornbuckle, who was then the CMO and president, now is the president of MGM Resorts, Ranjan Mishra and Anand Acharya, who work with ESS Analysis, which was a consulting group that was brought in to help with this project. So once again, I'm happy to be here, and the way we're going to do this is Josh is going to lead off and talk about the problem, and then I'll talk about what we actually did and what the solution was.
the irony is not lost on me that the only thing that stands between us and cocktails is a discussion about Vegas and casinos. That said, there we go. Whoop. Perfect. So thanks for having me here. This has been such a fascinating day. I really didn't know what to expect. Sanjog brought me along for the ride, so thank you for having me, and great day again. Before we talk about my company, just some context about the gaming industry in general, for those of you that don't know. Has anybody here been to Vegas before? Show of hands. Anybody gambled? Yeah, good, all right. So across the globe, the gaming industry is actually quite large, and some of these figures on the screen are from 2011. Some more current ones actually have the gaming industry eclipsing 50 billion, driven by a tiny little man-made island off of the coast of Hong Kong called Macau, which in its own right generated 45 billion last year. Nevada, though, is still a big chunk of gaming revenue that's tied to it. In fact, it's the biggest state from a gaming revenue standpoint. And you know, the one thing that always fascinates me about hearing and talking to folks like yourselves is that no matter what industry we come from, when we talk about things like customer analytics, there are so many similarities. It always is so interesting to me. And really, once you strip away the showrooms and the showgirls and the buffets and the nightclubs and all of that stuff, the movie stars, you know, this is not unlike any other multi-product firm, MGM Resorts. In the gaming industry at large, we have a set of products, goods and services that we put together. We spend a lot of time laboring over data to bundle them in the right way, determine what the right level of reinvestment is, and send them out to customers. We have fancier titles for some of these things that we leverage, like comps. Is anybody familiar with what comps are? Yeah, I see one. Anybody gotten any comps in Vegas? All right. For those of you that haven't, comps is jargon. You'll hear some Vegas jargon today. It's short for complimentaries, and that's really us reinvesting in our customers, giving certain parts of these promotional bundles away for free for the right level of customer to induce their spending patterns and trip patterns and to have them stay with us.
And if you're interested, you can contact Josh.
You can absolutely contact me. Yeah, so anyways, you know, it's really just a fancy way for us to say in our own Vegas way that comps are really loss leaders for us that we use to subsidize some of this other behavior that we'd like to see from these customers when they actually make it to Vegas. We spend a whole lot of time targeting our really high-end customers. It's interesting, your data and the distribution of the value of your customers, not unlike ours, you know, from the Cleveland Indians. And it can get expensive, and if you don't do it well, you can actually go broke, literally one customer at a time. Those that do it well, and there are a few, you heard Dr. Davenport talk about Caesars earlier today. Those that do it well really do rely heavily on analytics to create a meaningful segmentation-based marketing strategy. So that's enough about the gaming industry in general. Let's talk about my company, because I'm so proud of it. Anybody recognize any of these brands here? Yeah? Anybody recognize Gold Strike Tunica? Probably not. Anyways, if you find yourself in Tunica, go check it out. Fun place to be at. But we really do, as MGM Resorts, represent a lot of brands, and that actually is one of our challenges, is that we represent so many brands that it's difficult for us to convey the value proposition of the collection of all of these brands when you come to Vegas. People typically know about MGM Grand, largely because it's in the name of the corporation. People typically know about Mirage because of its lineage and its history. But some of these others, maybe other than Bellagio, may not ring true to a lot of you around the room. Moving from the brands to the numbers. some fun facts about MGM Resorts. There are a couple here that are probably more germane to the discussion today. The first one is that we have 65 million people in our database that we market to in various ways throughout the year, and that we have hundreds of food and beverage venues, from nightclubs and bars and lounges to restaurants and such. And we have hundreds of retail outlets too, so you can appreciate that our ability to make very personalized, meaningful offer bundles, if done the right way, really is pretty limitless there. Another interesting fact that doesn't really have much to do with today, but it does pose an interesting challenge to me, is the fact that we in Vegas run 90% on average from an occupancy standpoint throughout the year. And that's across 40,000 hotel rooms in Vegas. For those of you that aren't familiar with the hospitality industry, typical occupancy rates run around 60, 65, 70, depending on what market you're in. This capacity constraint really does mean not only do we have to do a great job of targeting the right customer with the right message and the right offer, but we also have to do it at the right time, because you'd hate to have someone come in and be sold out, which happens relatively frequently. So let's talk a little bit about our promotions. You'll hear this term used, free play. Really what free play is our trademark term for free gaming credits that we use, particularly for slot customers, to try and promote to them, have them come in and stay and play at our properties. They're free gaming credits to subsidize part of their normal gaming wallet, and it's very effective. I know that we're not supposed to segment our customer bases into cute little names, but it wouldn't be a talk about Vegas without some colorful terms. So there are some people that we'd like to avoid. Sanjog was very nice in calling them experts. We in Vegas call those people fleas. We don't like fleas. They're an interesting crowd. They typically come in, they have a pretty good, despite the corny name, they are pretty smart people. They have a pretty good working knowledge of how we structure our programs. And because of that, they can actually manipulate their behavior to kind of self-select into particular segments of our promotions. Now, the common behavior of a flea is someone who would come in, take that free play, run it through a slot machine, and then not gamble or wager anything on top of that. You can appreciate that doesn't do much for our ROI. Another common practice of the flea is to come in, take all of our comps, stay with us, eat with us, not pay a dime, and then go across the street and play at some of our competitor properties. Again, not a desired behavior. For everyone else, though, we historically, and this was one of the real reasons why we wanted to engage Sanjog and others for this case study. As big as our company is, and as much revenue as we generated, and as varied as our product set was, and even more so as varied as our spectrum of customer value is. We have customers that are $10 customers. We have customers that are $10 million customers. You can appreciate that you don't talk to them the same way. So that was really all we had to go off of, was what we called history-dependent targeting. What you got next time was largely predicated on what your activity was for the previous trips. Interesting, because a lot of times when people come to Vegas, Vegas isn't all about gambling. There's a booming convention business in Vegas, and a lot of times people that typically go to Vegas, on a leisure trip to gamble and do whatever else, sometimes come for conventions. And when you're there on a convention, you're not staying out and having fun with your friends playing blackjack. You're in bed thinking about what you're going to learn the next day. So gaming activity can ebb and flow, and when you have just a strict history-dependent targeting methodology, which we had for decades really, you're not going to get the most accurate result with that model. The other interesting thing is that we really marketed historically the same way to everyone based on that historical customer valuation model. Whether you were already going to come to Vegas, whether you had your trip booked already and your airfare booked already, or whether you were just thinking about coming to Vegas and if there was just that one more offer, you would come. You both got the same thing in the mail from me. So in essence, for the person that was coming out already, that was wasted money. That erodes our margin, and that is something that we need to figure out how to address in a more sophisticated way. The other interesting thing about the organization is that though there are folks like me who market the entire portfolio to customers, there is still some individual marketing activity going on at each of our resort casinos in Vegas. And so that, coupled with a less than optimal way of valuing customers, coupled with a little bit of variability from one property to the next when it comes to that formula, that algorithm of how to value customers, leads to some internal competition, which also gets towards margin erosion that we've seen more since 2007 and really have become damaging to the bottom line. So I think one more Vegas term for you, this term called THEO. That term stands for theoretical win. And a great way to think about it is via a slot machine, because it's a lot easier to understand. Every slot machine has what's called a hold percentage, or over time, if you were to wager, what percentage of that money would actually stay with the slot machine as opposed to going in your pocket. And the theoretical revenue, or the theoretical gaming revenue, is really just that whole percentage times the amount of coin in, or the amount of money that went into the slot machine. So a couple things to think about that we wanted to achieve. We really needed to have a singular objective metric of customer value out of this case study. That is because we need to, assuming it works, evangelize that and implement it across all of the different properties so that we didn't have these disparate ways of valuing and marketing to customers. Additionally, we wanted to have a model or set of models that was able to better predict the variability as customers moved in and out of different value segments for our different promotional efforts. The other thing is that Vegas has a tremendous influx every day of people who have never been to the destination before, and that's only amplified when you talk about first-time people that are signing up to our loyalty program, M-Life, and coming to our properties. If you have a customer valuation model that's solely based on historical gaming activity, and you have a guy coming in or girl coming in with zero gaming activity because they've never been there before, your offer is going to look pretty crappy to that customer. So we needed to come up with a way to better deal with those folks. The last thing we wanted to do is to get away from simply just saying because you're at a certain value, you're automatically cross-tabulated into this level of promotion with this level of reinvestment. Again, we wanted to avoid incenting, or at least incenting as much, those folks that were already going to come to Vegas anyway. So those were the three big objectives that we wanted to achieve. I'm going to hand it back over to Sanjog, who's going to give you some more detail about how we did that.
Okay, so just to recap, the fundamental problem is quite simple, right? We face this in all forms of marketing all the time. The key question here is, was MGM actually, drawing in customers to their properties because of the promotions they sent out, or were they sending out promotions because the customer had already shown up in their database? So in order to try and figure this out, we essentially decided to model behavior, just like any good academic would do, except that it turned out to be a lot more complicated than we thought, because behavior here is multifaceted. You have to start at the top of the funnel. Why is it that a particular guest decides to visit Vegas, if at all they decide to visit. If they do, which property do they choose out of the portfolio of different properties that MGM has? Which promotion do they use or utilize? So imagine you've got these, you've got a stream of these promotions arriving from the 9 or 10 properties from MGM and corporate MGM. And at any given point of time, there may be multiple promotions that are available to you that you can avail of, and you get to choose which one you want to use. And that determines in part whether you show up and which property you stay at. If we get all of those things done, then you need to figure out, well, when they show up, how much do they spend? And you can think of, again, drilling down on the spend metric to try and think about how much was spent on gaming, how much was spent on shows, how much was spent on consumption in terms of restaurants, and so on. Now, that's what we'll think of as the outcomes, and the inputs are all these targeted promotions that Josh talked to you about, right? And these promotions, I can tell you that first time we started looking at them, we were just completely blown away because there's literally thousands upon thousands of different combinations of promotions. And you can imagine, you can offer free plays, you can give room and board, you can have show tickets, you can choose which property that you want to promote, and so on. So this is the only mathy slide. Well, maybe there's one more mathy slide. But essentially think about building a model, right? You want to model all elements of a consumer's decision to show up, to choose to figure out which casino they want to visit, how much they want to spend, as a function of the things that MGM was doing. So in principle, this is not, we do this all the time, right? The trick, of course, is to figure out how do we account for this chicken and the egg problem, which is that MGM was sending those promotions out based on the past behavior of these same customers. So what we call in academia a classic endogeneity problem. Just a fancy word for the chicken and the egg problem. So we essentially built up a hierarchical framework and modeled the decision. And one of the things we did was we modeled the choice of the promotion. So, and this was a little trickier than it looks because you have to try and figure out what promotions were available to any given customer at a given point in time. Right? So you have to keep track of when the promotions arrive, when they die, and then see whether or not a particular customer had a particular promotion that was available. And then conditional on the choices that were being made, if you did see spend, you had to model that conditionally, and we used a fairly simple model to do that, to model those spends. Now, in theory, this was fairly straightforward, but for this one campaign that we are talking about, we had over 1 million consumers that that had to be tracked over a 3-year period, and every single touch point that this consumer, or every behavior that this consumer had. So truly large amounts of data, and Mary Gross is not here from Teradata, but Teradata was the kind of the data back end of all of this, and we spent a ton of time working with them, working with SAS, which was the analytics engine, to try and just construct a database that we could analyze, and that took a while. So here's the kind of reframing or restating the problem. So what we want to do is incredibly simple. You want to estimate the effect of promotion on spend, and that's that theta that you want, the slope of that curve. The problem is that MGM, being a smart firm, was targeting people who had higher spend. And so if you take the data at its face value, you would imagine that the slope was actually much higher than, or you would infer that the slope was much higher than it actually was. So how do you solve this? Well, luckily, we are working with the firm, and this is where the partnership really helps. Usually, as an academic, we would not have access to the last little bit, which is how did MGM actually go about targeting the consumer? Here, I could go in and I could talk to them and say, how did you guys do it? And there's, of course, it's not straightforward because it's a very, very complicated mechanism of how customers are targeted. But imagine that you could model that. Right? I'm not going into the details. The paper has all the details of this. If we could model that, then we could actually jointly model both the probability of a consumer getting a promotion and what they did with that promotion. So both the outcomes and the inputs are jointly modeled, not separately. Okay, so we had to propose a slightly different method because typical methods that we knew of just didn't apply in this case. So what we ended up doing was saying, okay, look, we know that the targeting rule essentially works as follows. there is the theo, this theoretical win, which is think of it as an index of past behavior. That's taken as an input, and the promotions are targeted based on that input. Now, what we found out, though, that it wasn't like you just took that theo and then decided on the basis of that, you bucketed different tiers of customers based on discrete segments of those theo. So there would be, and the first segment would get some promotion bundle 1, 2 would get 2, and so on. Okay? So the actual promotions X are a function of these past indicators. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is that within a bin, promotions are randomly allocated. So because of what our budget constraints, so if you've got 100,000 consumers in the first bin, not all 100,000 get the promotion, maybe only 20,000 get them, and those 20,000 are randomly allocated. Once we figured that out, what we realized was that within the bin, there is no problem. The chicken and the egg problem kind of goes away within the bin. So we said, that's fantastic. We can just model or build models one bin at a time. And that's incredibly simple to do once you've thought that process through. So estimate separate models for each bucket. And for those who are technically minded, this is an analogy to regression discontinuity, but I'm not going to talk about that here. There's a lot of bins, and there's a lot, as Josh alluded to, lots and lots of things that you can use to try and predict a particular consumer's behavior. So what I've not pointed out here is in the back end, think about it as having thousands of different X's, and there's a Bayesian model averaging algorithm that's sitting there on top doing dimension reduction, filtering out hundreds of thousands of models, bringing it down to ultimately 120 odd models. Each model had about 180 to 200 predictors in it for a total of about 20,000 parameters describing the population. None of these models are super sophisticated. They're fairly straightforward models. The work was in terms of parsing it down and getting to a point where these models actually ended up working. So the end result was that we were able to model things at the property, promotion, and person-specific predictors and try and tie that to promotion lift. And more importantly, this idea of spurious correlation, whether our promotions were affecting behavior or whether behavior was affecting promotions, that was taken out of the picture. The implementation was, we had to think through how you would use this. So it's not just about doing the analytics, but actually delivering the analytics to the front line. So this was something that came up earlier. There were dashboards that were built that were communicated to the marketing personnel at all of the MGM properties. And then the last part was, well, that's all fantastic. How do we know that all of this effort actually worked? So in order to evaluate that, as any good academic would do, we ran an experiment. And there were three groups, 2 test groups, and essentially a third control group. And the first group had about 600,000 consumers or guests in it. The second one, the same size, 600,000, and the last one the control group had 202. And the distinction was the following. In test group C, there was no corporate marketing done. So anything that came from corporate MGM was completely shut down. Each individual MGM property just continued to do whatever they were doing. So there were still promotions, but not from the one that we were trying to manipulate. Test group B was status quo. We just let MGM corporate do whatever they were doing. And test group A was essentially the results of our model using some optimization stack on top of that, targeting consumers and trying to figure out whether or not they should get a promotion, and if they got a promotion, what promotion should they get? Here's the results. We saw a little bit of a bump in revenue. So if you look at our new targeting mechanism, there's about $1 million that we got more in terms of revenues. But what we really thought we did well was shut down in terms of costs. So this point of, I don't like the term fleas, but the experts, the people who would have shown up anyway, the people who don't really, who you're wasting money on, we were able to shut those down fairly effectively to the tune of almost another $1 million or so. which gave us a total profit differential on this particular control experiment of about $1.6 million, which results in, and this doesn't look like a big number, an increment of about 20 cents of ROI. It's a big number. Just to give you if you translate this into an annual basis, you're talking about something close to 11 or $12 million. So what are the sources of improvement? Like I said, one improvement comes from the fact that we essentially moved away from average to marginal consumers. We didn't send promotions out to those people who would have shown up anyway, and the model was able to pick those out. And the second was we were able to increase revenues by effectively targeting consumers, giving them exactly the right mix of things that would entice them to come to one of MGM's properties. So if you happen to be like me, who does not gamble, irony there, but if you sent me a pair of tickets to see O at the Bellagio, you might actually get me to go, and maybe a dinner at Olive's or something. If you're like Eric, maybe something else entirely works.
I'm giving my M card to Josh right after this.
So like I said, if you keep if the same level of spending, you could get incremental revenues of about $12 million. And we think of that as a lower bound. And Josh will speak to this in a second about what he thinks the impact has been beyond this one study, right? Because one of the things that we were trying to do was get MGM, and Bill Hornbuckle, who's the president, he had the same shared vision of converting MGM into a analytics-driven, marketing science-driven organization. So there's other benefits that come about tangentially because of this study. Tertiary benefits, this point of having one cohesive value mechanism. Earlier, every single property had their own way of value. So even the idea of how they targeted was slightly different. Some would take 6 months Theo, others would take last trip Theo, and it would just be apples and oranges. Now there's kind of an agreement in terms of what the appropriate metric it is or should be, and it's based on some analytics. It's better cannibalization assessment, and importantly, there's consistency in targeting because everybody is using the same metric. It's not perfect yet. It's still work in progress, but it's getting there. So I'm going to let Josh kind of summarize in a second. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. Okay, good.
Oh, we're good, yeah.
Okay. But I'll just say that we think of this project as being, if you combine systematic quantitative analysis with managerial intuition, I don't think those two can be separated. I think academics need to go out and partner with firms a lot more and learn about how things are done and use that to better inform their models. And if you do that correctly, there's lots of gains. And I kind of applaud Eric and Pete's efforts here, which I think they've done a fantastic public service in terms of making that happen. And the other thing, selfishly for Harikesh and me, it's this idea of diffusing what we have done as marketing scientists, as in academics, and try to get and demonstrate that actually has value in the real world. So I'm going to leave it up to Josh to have the final word to talk about what he thinks this has meant for MGM.
Yeah. All jokes aside, I do think that this work has served as the foundation for what's really been a transformation from an analytics and particularly from a marketing standpoint for the company. And I'll tell you that 11 million has been blown away from incremental sort of revenue benefits that we've seen. And there are corresponding substantial reductions in typical marketing expenses as a result as well. It's served as the foundation for transforming what was once, a collection of very independent brands that were managed very independently, which worked really well until about 2006, 2007. Then when we needed to band together and create synergies and realize benefits of the scale of the company, this has been truly one of the foundational pieces to help us get together not just up and down the strip in Las Vegas, but really across the country to develop a nationwide marketing organization. And we couldn't have done it without the help of Sanjog and others and it truly, the best is yet to come. That's the exciting part of this talk for me, is that we're still only scratching the surface 3 and 4 years later. This is a big effort with demonstrable big results already, and even I can see them out there, bigger results to come on the horizon.
So I have the honor of being able to moderate the Q&A period with Josh and Sanjog. Questions? Yep. Well, I see you're with a microphone right there, so let's start there, and then you'll be next.
So one of the original business goals was to understand how to target first trips. And extending that a little bit, one could imagine that your models need to change as you collect more information on your customers, which sort of leads to the idea of a Bayesian model that updates itself based on new information. Did you incorporate that into your modeling as well?
Yes and no. So the yes part is I completely get the point. One of the nice things that happened because of the way the promotions were stacked. Remember, we estimated the model by these tiers, and if we can go into this offline, but if you work the math off, and I think either Eric or Pete asked this question to Harikesh when he presented it here, which is there's a probability of seeing any past behavior. How does that drop out of the model? The answer is it really doesn't, but you condition on that because you always track that person. So I don't need to integrate over it. I don't need a Bayesian framework because the transitions of over a consumer's lifetime is always conditioned on their past behavior, and they just transition based on their past data from one tier to another, and they can move back and they can move forward, and depending on dynamically at any given point in time where they are, there is an appropriate set of targeting rules for them now.
I think the better place for, and we, I should tell you organizationally, there's a team of, dare I say, data scientists that report to me since our work with ESS and with Sanjog. And it's not necessarily the valuation model of the customer, to Sanjog's point, that changes relatively frequently, although there are minor tweaks made to that, probably monthly, every other month. Where we change models and update models often is when it comes to appropriate offer assignment, due in large part to that 90% occupancy figure, but also due in large part to other more macroeconomic factors that may or may not need to be built in to the offer assignment models as well.
I think before we get to that, someone had a hand up over here. Before we get to that point, by the way, I think also part of Len's point, which is a problem I'm sure many people face, and let's frame it in the context of what Sanjog and Josh have done. As someone moves from one Theo tier to another, one could question whether their marketing responsiveness travels with them. Is it a static thing, or is it something that has to be modeled every person for every level of Theo? And that's partly Len's question, which is what happens as someone moves between tiers. You know, that's a challenge everybody faces, because eventually if every person has to have a different responsiveness for every Theo level, that's a big challenge. And the reason it's so prescient with me is Ellie, Daniel, and I are working on a problem just like this now. And so afterwards, I'm going to ask you what you think about it. But either way, next question.
I just wanted to clarify on the experiment itself. I didn't quite understand. What was the difference between the status quo group and the control group? They sounded very similar.
They are similar with one big difference. So just to back up, in the control group, so imagine that there are 10 MGM properties, and then there is corporate MGM that Josh's team is on. Those 10 properties continue to have their promotions. They continue to send out promotions. Corporate promotions were completely shut down. There were 0 promotions. Status quo is essentially what MGM was doing at that point. 10 would send out their promotions, and corporate would send out their own promotions on top of that.
Gotcha.
So our analysis was based on only corporate's marketing activity.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm not just saying this because my colleague Jerry Wind is here. The smile across Jerry's face when that slide went up about an experiment If you want to know the answer to whether an algorithm or a proposed way is effective, you can fit any mathematical model you want, and simulating some counterfactual from that model. But if you really want to know the answer, run an experiment. There's no substitution for running an experiment. And so it's a great example of how academics will always push, if possible, towards running an experiment. Of course, we're not the ones that have to pay for it or convince people internally to do it. But it's not surprising to me that any academic project will have an experiment as the kind of the gold at the end of the rainbow.
And just to that point, though, this is where I think I give a lot of credit to Bill Hornbuckle, to Josh, and to everybody at MGM. I mean, this was not a small experiment. This was an expensive experiment, and it could have had serious implications for the firm. And it took some, I don't know, is there a term in Vegas for this?
Rolling the dice? Isn't it rolling the dice, John?
Sure.
Yeah. So,
I saw some other hands up. Other questions for Josh and Sanjay? Other questions? Yeah, please. Jim?
I'm curious. I mean, it looks like one of your outcomes is that now, either from a prospecting perspective or a past guest perspective, you can do things like determine what property, either brand and or property, would sort of be the most optimal opportunity for an individual. Did you guys work that all the way down in such a way that the different brands and property owners felt like that this wasn't somehow going to disenfranchise certain locations and maybe force you to shut some down eventually or something like that? And how did all that work?
Great question. And some of the work that's been done since this experiment has tackled just that. Up to the recent history, we had pretty crude ways of telling which properties you preferred. And in fact, it actually has hurt us a lot, because if there was only one property you liked and for whatever reason you grew disenfranchised with that property, you were forever still tagged as someone who really only liked that property. So we never really introduced you to other assets in our portfolio. Since then, and since the experiment that we just walked through, there's been a number of models put together to determine not only individual customers' propensity, because customers, no one likes to stay cooped up in one property. There's any number of research sources that will show that. So now we're able to better tell through some other modeling efforts, and I'm not going to be able to get into the academic terms of what they are. My guys can. But they do a great job of predicting that because you like Bellagio and because you like Aria, there's a really high propensity, especially because you're of a certain age and you come from a certain part of the country, that you really love to go to the Mirage as well. And that's just one of many ways that we've cross-pollinated and really introduced our customers to that's one of the ways that we're answering that tough question of making them aware of everything that exists within MGM Resorts. There's this other lookalike model, not unlike what the Nielsen gentleman was talking about, that we've created to help further that cross-pollination across all the properties. And we've also been able to use that relatively successfully, back to your question about the new customers, to better target earlier on what we think those new customers are going to look like. You can't tell if a guy is going to be worth $5 million just by walking in the door, but you can certainly tell that based on a number of characteristics that these are the types of things you should talk to them about.
Of course, this was quite a loaded question, of course, because Jim is one of the chief research officers at Urban Outfitters, which has multiple brands, as people know, Urban Outfitters, Free People, and Anthropology, and they worry quite a bit about, both substitution and complementarity across brands. Maybe we have time for one more question.
I think Jerry had a question.
Well, I'll turn to Ralph. Ralph, go ahead.
I'm just curious, in the three different groups you used, two of them obviously that you were comparing, you used 600,000 as your sample size, and the other you used 200,000. So how did you come to the different sample sizes, and where's the statistical significance in that?
So it's practical significance rather than statistical significance. We had obviously, as academics, wanted to go with. So our original plan was shut down all promotions to 600,000 people, and that didn't quite.
That didn't fly.
No. So then we said, well, okay, let's shut down corporate promotion to 600,000. That didn't fly. And the agreement was to do a third. I mean, I understand the practical ramifications here. It's a risky thing to shut. If you believe that your promotions are working, and you take 600,000 people and you shut something down, that can have a significant impact. So I don't think there's any. Given that these were completely randomly allocated, the size of the pool is big enough that if we had done 200, 200, 200, I think that would be fine too. They agreed to do 600, 600, 200, which worked for us. We didn't tell them that it would be okay to do 200, 200, 200.
Well, let's thank Josh and Sanjog for a great presentation.